Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Engage Houston's public workshop on messaging the moment, presented by Jessika Davidson of Keith Creative Lab. A few housekeeping items. Please make sure that your microphones are muted, but you're welcome to have your cameras on. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put those questions in the chat. Engage Houston is a professional development program operated by Mid-America Arts Alliance, and the professional development program is for arts and culture organizations in the greater Houston area and the 9 surrounding counties. And our focus is to support arts and culture organizations, ensure their viability, small to mid-sized organizations, ensure their viability, and make sure that they're able to compete and thrive within the arts ecosystem, particularly in an era that we all find ourselves in. And so we thought it would be important in the era of Black Lives Matter, in the era of a global pandemic, that a lot of our institutions are finding themselves struggling about how to message the moment, how to communicate with audiences, approaches, techniques and tools that you can utilize to make sure that your digital marketing strategy reflects your perspective and what you like to accomplish in communicating with your audiences and communities. So a little bit about Jessika. She has led award-winning teams in various digital and marketing roles, and her job and what she loves to do is to bring participatory experiences to various organizations' virtual audiences. As a consultant, Davidson has worked to build several nonprofit digital presence to foster learning, creativity, and shared discovery as a means to transform our understanding of various advocacy topics in modern society. She is always interested in opportunities to connect the intersections of technology, social justice, race, and history. Her projects include building digital strategy and fostering audience engagement for the LGBTQ+ community, arts organizations, museums, science advocacy communities, and voter engagement organizations. Some of Jessika's clients have included the Hurston Wright Foundation for Black Writers, Public Citizen Texas, March for Science, Pantsuit Nation, and Jack Hadley Museum. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Jessika to offer a presentation. Welcome, Jessika.
Thank you. And hi, everybody. I just want to do a check with Kelly that you can hear me. Everyone can hear me clearly? Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay, so Kelly already introduced me, so I'm going to keep this part short so we can get to the meat of the presentation. My name is Jessika Davidson. I'm the founder of Keith Creative Lab. So this came about because in addition to my consulting projects, I've also worked in-house. I know what it means to be that one-person team. And so that means I've created social media graphics, written the social media content, down to folding the end-of-year campaign letters and putting them in the mailbox myself. And so what I recognized was that my situation wasn't unique and that a lot of people were dealing with this and they needed support. And so what we do at KIT is provide you with a team of very great independent creatives and create an agency for nonprofits, whether it's for an event, a campaign, or just general support. And we do that so that they can feel supported without having to contact a huge agency. So we become the communications and development family to any nonprofit that we work with. So I'm really excited to share some of my insights on the arts and culture sector because that's where my heart lies. And I think there are a lot of opportunities to catalyze change through our messaging. So considering the topic that we're going to discuss over the next hour, I find it only appropriate to ground our conversation by starting with Toni Morrison. I hold a deep admiration for her 1993 Nobel Prize lecture, which addressed the question of language and violence in a way that really nobody else has been able to do previously or since. So as a marketer, every day I use language and I can experience how language can be divisive, how it can be dangerous and exclude people, but also it has the power to bring people together and build power. So I'm not going to read the whole quote, but I thought the last sentence was extremely powerful. Sex is language, race is language, theistic language, all are typical of the policing languages of mastery and do not permit new knowledge or encourage the mutual exchange of ideas. And, you know, really what I always tell people is that words mean things. It's very important to be intentional. And particularly in the arts and culture sector, it's important to be intentional about how we message. So since we're talking about anti-racism and messaging, I want to dive into a very surface level definition of anti-racism that will help us frame the conversation. So being anti-racist results from a conscious decision to make frequent, consistent, and equitable choices every day. When we aren't consciously making those anti-racist choices, we unconsciously, or in some cases consciously, uphold aspects of white supremacy, white dominant culture, and unequal institutions in society. So being racist or anti-racist is not about who you are, it's about the actions that you take. So today we're going to be talking about the actions of some organizations, and you know, in some cases you might have also taken these actions, and so we want to be able to talk about the correct way to remedy that or the appropriate response. And so one of the things we're going to start with are the wrong actions to take. The first is performative allyship. The second will be choosing silence over your audience. And the third would be failure to read the room, as they say. So let's jump into examples of each and the correct way to approach these statements. So brands and performative allyship. When I worked in-house for organizations, like I said, I was the person who did everything. Sometimes some of the marketing responsibilities weren't my role, but it has to get out, right? So I definitely have lived that life, and many nonprofits, even at a larger level on a national scale that I've worked with, have one, and if they're lucky, two people in their marketing department. And so I realized how, you know, you have to get content out. You have to get messaging out. But in this current climate, marketers found themselves in a very intense position. When you think about everything that has happened in 2020, they have a myriad of responsibilities. So it's like, okay, I have programming. We now have done all this digital pivoting. We have coronavirus. We have Black Lives Matter. And so, you know, that 1, 2, or 3-person team that was responsible tends to just put something out. So I'm going to read this graphic, and I want you to think about if this seems familiar to what you've heard from corporations down to local organizations, or even familiar to something that your organization might have put out. We at Brand are committed to fighting injustice by posting images to Twitter that express our commitment to fighting injustice. To that end, we offer this solemn white on black JPEG that expresses vague solidarity with the Black community, but would quietly elide the specifics of what is wrong, what needs to change, and in what ways we would do anything about it. This is doubly true if Brand is particularly guilty of exacerbating these issues. We hope this action encourages you to view Brand positively without, you know, expecting anything from us. Brand, you know the ones. Now, does this seem familiar to anybody? Have you heard anything similar? Have you put out anything similar? You know, I understand it. We've all been there. We have to push something really quick. And so we just do what feels right. This statement doesn't feel wrong, right? But it also doesn't offer any solutions. It doesn't address the issue. It makes it seem distant and far away. And it doesn't place responsibility on, you know, being part of the change. Another example is Blackout Tuesday. So Blackout Tuesday actually started in the music industry. Two women who worked in the industry wanted people to not spend money on any form of music to show the power of the Black dollar. Unfortunately, this was co-opted by several brands and organizations to be an opportunity to just stand in solidarity. So when we all rushed to make that draft that statement, push, donations to a certain organization, black out our logos, and, say how we want to show solidarity. We do it because there's no playbook for this moment, right? So we've seen this before, but we haven't seen this cultural shift before. And because we're not sure of this quote unquote new normal, as we like to say, we don't have those rules for engagement on how to approach this. Well, I'm here today to help you work through that, but I'm also here today to tell you it's past the time that we create some messaging frameworks around equity and social justice issues, even as arts organizations. 2020, if nothing else, has proved that some brands need some rules in place well before we're hit with this, triple threat crisis. So if company values like diversity and inclusions are clear, and if these conversations have been made with executive leadership as well as with marketing and communication staff, then you know the right approach to take without having it backfire and really presenting baseless statements. So we're also going to talk about another example of what not to do. We talked about performative allyship that's really in, baseless statements, no solutions, really goes towards hashtag activism, where we're just doing it to keep on trend and not to be part of change. And then we're going to jump into the next thing not to do, which is to be silent and or erase your original statement. And so say you didn't copy and paste the statement. Maybe you did one of the following. You didn't post anything because you believe the art should be neutral. It should be a safe space for people to come in and not experience the ills of the world, right? Or two, you posted something, and this happens more often than not, and in fear of alienating your audience, you decide to delete it. More importantly, alienating your donors. So this happened at the Seattle Children's Museum. They wanted to educate their audience, children, about how to take anti-racist approaches to building children's relationships with friends and families and understanding privilege. It was taken down almost immediately after the executive director believed that this might alienate audiences, particularly major donors. What resulted was major news coverage, negative news coverage. I know we say no press is bad press, but that's not the case here. And also a walkout from their remaining employees that haven't been furloughed. So they went from being, a mid-sized children's museum with a statement to now getting national coverage about what not to do. So let's discuss why neither is the approach you should take, which is not posting anything or deciding to take it down. Have you heard before that silence is complicity, especially in the age of social media? It might be easy to say that we can't be neutral or provide safe spaces for every single cause or thought. I've heard it before in multiple organizations and trainings, and even as a staff member. So let's not compromise our mission, right? Let's just focus on what we do and be a safe space. Well, if you share that belief, and I can understand that from also having been a fundraiser, I want you to consider who you believe isn't comfortable with your neutral viewpoint. Think about your audience and why you think it might be okay to exclude them for the sake of your donors. Arts organizations must ask themselves, honestly and genuinely, are inclusivity and really important to us? If the answer is yes, we can't stay silent. We cannot. Another example that went horribly wrong is the Guggenheim. So recently, they've been called out by their first Black curator since the end of last year for institutional racism. And in the last 2 months, they've had curators write actual letters calling on a reform because the culture at the museum enables racism. One thing we have to do is read the room. We have to be clear about the risk of entering narratives that we're not ready to participate in. The curator who sparked the original outrage has a huge profile. a huge social media following, is way more digitally savvy than the museum as far as utilizing her networks. She was in New York Times, in Essence, and had other large profile influencers share her story after the Guggenheim made these statements. And so they weren't ready to respond about what they're actually doing, and they just posted. And since, they still have not made a really good statement. They've just posted, "We hear you." And that isn't sufficient. Our audiences are very smart. They're very plugged in. They have the receipts, so they're ready to see actual structural change within the organization. So if you're in a case right now where your brand perception is not positive, the best thing to do in this case is to actually hire an outside agency, honestly. They're going to help you navigate some of those risks and build the appropriate narrative to how you're going to, create solutions internally that will build, some positive brand perception, but also institute some real change. So say you made some similar mistakes. You haven't read the room. You weren't really aware of your brand perception, or didn't consider it when you put out a statement, or you put out a statement with no follow-up since. And people wondering, are you really an ally of the movement? Like I said, the whole "there's no press, such thing as bad press," that's not true if you don't have a response. The unfortunate truth is these moments will continue to happen. And I like to think that you're here today because you acknowledge that this isn't a one-time thing and you need to be prepared. So this is crisis communications. And what are the best approaches to that? One, slow down. You do not have to respond to a moment within a day or two of it happening. When brands choose to do that, their responses are incomplete and often very reactive than strategic. They don't come with solutions. They make promises they can't deliver on. So you might even institute, and I would highly recommend, a 24-hour to 48-hour pause on responses, and have that be just your standard operating procedures as an organization. The second step is to choose your strongest spokesperson, someone who's going to be a co-creator in your response and your statement. Also, I want to flag, this is not the time to decide to elevate people of color to do the work. So if that's your strongest spokesperson, it needs to be because they're in a space of leadership and they can craft an authentic message that shares their perspective, not just for visibility. And then your third is to acknowledge the situation. Apologize if you play a role in any of the injustice. If you have no people of color in leadership, if you have barriers to access to your program, acknowledge that in the statement and then provide actionable solutions on the next steps. Also, be able to be held accountable. So let's talk about good statements. What do good statements do and what do they look like? So the Center for Social Inclusion talks about three unique components of a good statement, right? You affirm. So you say, we share these core values and we hope that our audience share them as well. So you reinforce that idea that we're here together, and that's how you bring them in. They say you get more bees with honey than vinegar. So that's step one. Step two is to counter. Say, we believe this is true, but the reality is, unfortunately, it isn't. And this is what drives the inequality. Also, this is the time for you to plug yourself in and also bring your audience into the frame. Let's talk about, hey, we acknowledge that some of our audience members might also be feeling the stressors of the moment, and then transform. Bring it all back together. Let's talk about how we can transform the current reality to that vision that we, started off with when we were trying to affirm and lock down those core values. So a statement that indicates leadership and thoughtfulness will incorporate the affirm, counter, and transform framework in one or more of the following ways. It's going to acknowledge the issue, It's going to take responsibility for its role in the issue, if there is one. It's going to take a clear stance, clear and transparent stance. And it's going to provide actions that demonstrate understanding of the issue. And in some cases, it might even make a pledge, whether that's financial or just a pledge to completely change programming or a promise. Another thing it might do is that the audiences should feel like they're left with a way to hold you accountable. And there are multiple ways to do that. That can be setting up a submission form. That can be saying that we're going to address this in our nonprofit. There are various ways to set up, accountability for your organization. It's also important that organizations avoid supporting counter narratives. How many times have we seen we're all one race, the human race? These counter narratives support actually harmful stances, or they distract from the issue at hand. And so you want to make sure that you're not saying, let's not talk about it because it's divisive. Let's worry about the arts. Let's talk about, how this feels opportunistic at the time. You never want to do that. And I'm sharing this list because organizations often do this when they are being reactionary, or in some cases when they think that it will calm down their audiences or be satisfactory enough so they can move on to the next thing. So let's look at our first example of a good statement. The Whitney Plantation in Louisiana is a museum. And they posted on Instagram first their statement. And the first thing that's important to me is that they affirm, hey, everybody knows that it's, everybody feels the pain of losing a loved one, or we can sympathize with that. And so that's how they hook them in. Our hearts are with the families of those who've lost loved ones. And then also they talk about the right to peaceful protest. Now, of course, there's conversation about what's peaceful and what's not, but we agree that that is a constitutional right. When they continue on to their statement, there are a few things that I really think were great in this statement. And if you go look at it, it had a great reception from their audience. The only meaningful change comes from activism. So they're taking their stance and they're being very clear in their support. And in the third image here on their statement, you see that they highlight what they're planning to do and opportunities to educate their audience. So they did a virtual book club, and they also announced their reopening. And there are two important things that are going to follow. You want the full support of your organization. When you put out messaging, particularly if you have a marketing or communications manager, coordinator, person, whatever title you give them, you don't want them to feel like you have left them siloed with a statement that you don't support. So they had their executive director sign it, in addition to their board of directors. And unlike a lot of different organizations, I hadn't seen too many board of directors sign on in solidarity with the statement. That provides some extra value to the audience that these are the ideals. We're committed to anti-racism. And so when we start talking about, how to arrange communications meetings, you need to make sure that from the front line to the, boardroom, that everybody who can be involved is involved so you can make these strong statements. Now, the Whitney Plantation Museum is fairly large, so I want to give an example of a great statement from a very small theater. So Twilight Theater Company had their artistic director put out a statement as well. I want to highlight a few things that they did that I thought were amazing. So they said that they highlighted that they have diversity. They also acknowledged that they could do better. And so she put, I also recognize that we can and we should do better to actively combat racism and condemn brutality. As a community theater, community comes first. That's where that value is, that value statement that your audience agrees with. In that spirit, we are making a renewed commitment to. This is offering solutions. And then they list all of the solutions that they are offering. And then they end with what I love is how are we going to be kept accountable? So they say, do you have any thoughts or suggestions on how to keep improving? I love to hear them. Contact me directly. This is a great statement because it's like, hey, this is how you keep me accountable. We want to be connectors in this work. We acknowledge that this work isn't easy, and we're actively seeking the opinions of the communities that we serve. A great statement. And then I have a great statement from across the pond. So everything doesn't have to be on social media. Obviously, in the digital world that we're working in now, a lot of it is. But you can also send this out across various channels. And I would absolutely recommend that once you do come up with messaging and statements around diversity and inclusion, particularly around race, that this lives on your website, because your website is your main real estate piece. So Southeast Dance in the UK also released a statement recognizing the racism in the dance sector, and that they also have a role in creating change. And they acknowledge that it's not going to be easy. And one thing that I want to point out that I love is that our efforts to address the climate emergency and tackle social inequalities, including the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, disability, and class, connect with this crucial work too. They acknowledge that everything they do, even as a dance company, is intertwined in the communities that they serve and the communities that work within the dance company itself. That acknowledges the value of where they are, as far as we're not just in the community, we are the community. And they lay out a 4-point plan. And at the end, they say, we are holding ourselves accountable to this plan, and we'll be publishing outcomes and learnings every year in our annual report, a public document. One thing I want you to take some time to think about as I shift to the next slide are the opportunities. Well, I would say the time that you've actually seen some follow through. So in June, we all saw a bunch of different statements. Can you count on one or two hands how many organizations have followed up with programming, with changes, with responses? Once again, our audience is waiting for us to be authentic and to do follow up. So let's get into how you can rebuild your organization's messaging through an equity lens and avoid some of the mishaps that we reviewed earlier. So we're going to talk about communication strategy and messaging. And I always like to preface it like this. When you sit down with your staff to create or revise your communication strategy, I suggest splitting these following slides into various meetings. This is very heavy work. It's going to have a lot of different opinions. And so if you try to squeeze this into a staff meeting, if you try to squeeze this, if you have a weekly communications meeting or a bi-weekly communications meeting, it's not going to be effective. It's not going to be something that is strongly supported by everybody at the organization. So take your time. And even if you feel like you don't have time, communication strategies can take months. So at the very least, I would say break each one of these steps up into an individual meeting or even 2 meetings. So at each step of the process, what I'm going to do is let you know who should be at each meeting and how to proceed to the next step. The first step is self-reflection. Before you put pen to paper or start typing up anything in a Google Doc that's going to be representative of your organization, you have to self-reflect, understanding that your team's implicit and unconscious biases are the keys to opening the door to equity. So I have a list of questions here that everybody should answer as an organization. So who's going to be in this meeting? Let's talk about that. When you have this meeting, this is really high level. So I would recommend that your board is here, and this might even be part of your board meeting. I definitely would recommend that your communications and or development director or manager is there, and your executive director. The questions are, what work are you doing internally to fight institutional racism? How accessible are you making that information? And that refers to different channels. Are you putting it in email? Is it on your website? Is it on social media? Are you translating that in Spanish or any other languages that are common in your community? How many Black, Indigenous people of color are in leadership? Are they visible? Are they visible when it's not just Black History Month or Hispanic Heritage or Asian Pacific Islander month? Or do they make the decisions? Are they just at the table, or are they able to institute change? Are you owning your mistakes as an organization? And are you making amends or excuses? Are you donating to and or partnering with Black and Brown community organizations? If you're a local theater, is there a way for you to partner? Have you been doing it? Have you been in the community for 60 years and you really haven't thought about that? You know, it's important to have these questions, have answers to these questions as you go forward with restructuring your communication strategy. And then another question I have here is what, is the percentage of Black, Indigenous, people of color art or artworks do you have in your exhibitions and your programming? So you're wondering, okay, why do we need to sit down and do this? It's because this helps you avoid those risks when you do respond. When we talked about not being aware of your brand perception, it's super important that you have these self-reflection moments so you can understand where there are gaps and mishaps in your organization that you will have to communicate, or there'll be a public response that won't be so favorable. So I would recommend using a tool called Project Implicit. And it's a website, so you can Google it, and it offers a tool to test your implicit associations about race. But then it also goes beyond that, and then you can also test your bias against gender, sexual orientation, and other identities. I would have your board members or whoever is going to be at this meeting, I would have them use that tool so you can identify where those gaps are in your organization. So after you have this meeting, the first thing that comes to mind is, okay, what's the next step, right? How do we jump and talk about it? Well, okay, there might need to be some changes at the institutional level, but from a communication standpoint, you need to make sure that the board members sign off on this. There's nothing stronger than having your board support, right? It helps you manage those donors who might find some of your statements a little uncomfortable. So you want to make sure that everyone leaves this meeting, or this series of meetings rather, feeling very comfortable about stepping into restructuring your communication strategy. And then you jump into what I call the checklist. So the checklist is going to be a few things that you need to check that are going to help you restructure your communication strategy with an equity lens. First is going to be check your language. You need a style guide. And if you are a communications professional, this is not the first, second, third, or fourth time that you've heard the term style guide. I recommend them just not even within a DEI lens, but there are various elements to a style guide. That's going to be your logo, your brand colors, your icons, your slogans. But as we are going towards this progressive world that we're living in, they need to evolve to include how we use inclusive language. Not having a style guide essentially can, and often, results in a hodgepodge of different styles or approaches. It's chaotic. At worst, it can be problematic. I want you to take a few seconds to think about times where you've seen any organization, particularly nonprofits, because they do have limited capacity. So they might have 4 or 5 people working on things where it sounds like it's coming from 10 different people. There's a flyer that's 15 different colors. There's a writing style that's different in their email communications versus their typical, social media posts. So you don't want to lack the cohesion, but especially when you're talking about issues around race and also gender and sexuality. So I have some key pointers here. The B in Black is capitalized. That's official as far as AP style as of July. Latinx is gender neutral and widely used. So you might see the term BIPOC or POC. So the B and the I mean Black, Indigenous, people of color, or people of color. At the same time, it's great to note that person of color and Black are not synonymous. Also, person of color and immigrant are not synonymous. Using the term minority implies inferior social position, And it also might not be true. So I'm based in Houston, Texas. If you refer to someone who's Latinx as the minority, that is not true for our city at all. And so that's through some racist framing that's old and outdated. And so you want to make sure you're not utilizing that in your communications. And then the term marginalized or underutilized or underserved is definitely more appropriate. Avoid any generalizations based in race or ethnicity, especially those that are common with, a history rooted in oppression. A really good example of that is if you have, upcoming performance and you refer to your Black, your Black performer as sassy or foxy or full of fire. Be aware and do an audit of the language that you use across all of your channels to make sure that it's not problematic. So who needs to be in the style guide meeting? The style guide meeting can go one of two ways. You can have your communication staff draft it and have the staff approve or the executive director approve. Or you can bring someone in, which is highly recommended to help you through this. A really good example, if you don't have the capacity or the financial budget to do so, there's an organization called Some of Us, SUM. So Some of Us, and they have a progressive style guide that goes over various different identities, gender identities, sexual identities, indigenous identities, race, social class. So I would recommend using that. Let's talk about how language progresses. That style guide is probably the premier style guide in progressive organizations. It was created in 2016. Some of that language has changed. So it's ever evolving. If you are ever unsure what to do, then that's why I would say bring in an expert. Obviously, if you're an individual talking to someone, they might have a whole different perception, but you want to make sure that this is consistent as an organization. So once you're done, and if you're making changes to your style guide, everybody needs to be updated. So the messaging you're using to represent your organization is consistent across all your communications channels, but also for all of your internal stakeholders. You would really, hate to see that break in communication if you have a board member reaching out to a donor. So make sure that everybody has a copy of the style guide once it's finalized and approved within your organization. Next, you want to check your tone. Are you representing or playing into any stereotypes? Are there photos and language that you use that play into that? I put a few examples here. One is using white actors to portray Asian actors during performances. I found someone who's in the ballet who said, ballet, the idea that ballet is the foundation of all dance forms is racist and rooted in white supremacy. If you go without teaching the history of ballet, without its cultural context as a European ethnic folk dance, then are you really serving your community by giving them without giving them the actual history and background? If you're talking about how you want some of your performers or staff members who are people of color to tame their hair for performances. If you only give them certain roles. If you see this photo I have from the Tisch School of the Arts, they actually asked students who were in the art school to post different microaggressions they've gotten as arts professionals. So if any of the language that you use internally, but also on your external channels communicate these stereotypes, this is the time to do the audit of that. And then also when you're doing that audit, have you considered all possible audiences when you're pushing out social media, when you're pushing out email? Who has been historically excluded? Those are things that you need to be aware of during your audit process. Are the messages and images that you communicate inclusive, respectful? Are they truthful and equitable across all audiences? Will the people who are portrayed in your imagery, in your storytelling, will they feel included in the way that they're represented? You can't talk about oh, wow, we love our diverse community and city, and do a video and have maybe 1 or 2 seconds of a 3-minute video showing a diverse community. In what ways can you remedy that? Once you do that audit, it's really time to reframe your messaging so it communicates and fosters inclusion, respect, and equity. So you have 2 different approaches you can take. Once you do that audit, identify areas that are problematic. The preferred approach is to edit and remove those items. So if you have a video, like I just talked about, that doesn't truly reflect the diversity of your staff, the communities you are serving or want to serve, then you need to edit that video, or you can remove it. The other choice is to address the issue and explain why you will continue on with the show, or ways that you will make changes. A great example of that is recently, over the last 2 years, they've done live performances of, and this is on a major scale, All in the Family and the Jeffersons, shows that we love, we might have grown up on, or our family members love, right? They started each live performance with a statement about how the language used not even 40 or 50 years ago is extremely problematic, and they acknowledge that. And that's actually an opportunity for you at home to educate your family members. That's another way you can go about it if you aren't going to remove or edit. You can educate. And so last on our checklist is to check your silence. So for a lot of people, this is going to be new, right? And so as arts leaders, we can't operate and continue to operate as though it's business as usual and wait for this normal feelings to come back, because nothing moving forward is going to feel familiar. So you should want to leverage this point to ensure that your organization is building a stronger future. And in this case, if you've never made these kind of statements, it's okay to have a sounding board before you go public with your new way of messaging around equity and race issues. That sounding board also needs to be equitable. It can't, be a sounding board for messaging and there are no people that are differently able. There are no LGBTQ people on the sounding board. There are no people of color. So be aware of that and come up with a strategy around how to introduce this to audiences so it's not jarring. Okay, so you have done all the things on the checklist. You've had a meeting, you come up with a sounding board to check your messaging, you've done an audit of all of the different ways you communicate. You're wondering what's next. How do I actually put the pen to the paper, and what are the elements, the key elements to creating messaging around different equity topics, particularly those around race? So in social justice circles, this has been operating for a few years. The Opportunity Agenda always recommends this when talking about different social justice issues around criminal reform and immigration, but it actually works with any different sector. So it works for the arts too. There are going to be 4 different pillars that you want to address when you're building out messaging within an equity lens. The first is going to be value. So once again, begin by connecting your audience over your shared values. 2 is going to be the problem. So introduce the problem you're addressing and explains how it threatens the values that you share or want to share and want to get better about. 3 is solutions. Tell the audience how the problem can be solved. Quickly pivot to a solution. We're not here to be victims and villains and any of that. We're not trying to identify that. We're trying to identify what are the appropriate actionable next steps, right? We don't want anybody to fall in what we call compassion fatigue and they're not motivated to take action next. And then finally, you want to do actions. Give your audience examples of actions or actions they can take. So using this, and I'm going to do this from a general arts perspective, let's talk about value. So we believe the arts are for everyone. And I'm going to say that's the shared value of everybody who's here with us today. The problem is that we recognize that there are barriers to access to the arts, whether it's as a performer and an artist, not having access to different things because of income inequality, whether you're told there are no roles for you because you're a person of color. So we know that there are barriers to access. What's the solution? Well, the solution is that we believe that equity is crucial and it takes work, but equity is crucial to the success of our industry. And then what are the actions we're going to take? And that's going to be different per arts organization. And so you need to determine what actions you can take that are realistic within your budget, that you can roll out in phases. Everything doesn't have to happen at once. Remember, this is continued engagement. This is a continued commitment to communities of color, to underserved communities. So this might take some time to determine what those action items look like. And they don't have to be a 10-year plan. It can be preliminary actions that you're taking immediately and long-term actions. So considering what we just said, let's put that together for a statement. So we believe that the arts are transformative. We can shift what we create can shift the course of people's lives and catalyze change. Value. Sentence 2. Problem. We recognize that there are many existing systems, right, that grant privilege and provide barriers to access. And even within our own organizations, these systems have been at play, from the leadership to the community and patrons we serve. That's the problem. Solution. We strongly believe equity is crucial to the success of our industry and our organization, and we're ready to work. We hope you'll join us. Solution, going into action. And then you would end it with, we've taken some time to reflect on our organization and our beloved community, and we're working in the following ways to improve access to our program and achieve equity within our organization. And then you would list it. And that's how you build a key messaging structure around racial equity and inequity in your organization. While you're here, and you're at this point of building out, your messaging, I would recommend that you do that for other issues and identities. And I also would recommend that once you get that general messaging, that you create a diagram with links to next steps. And the reason you would do that is because you want to integrate this message as well as the actions that you want to take into your overall communication strategy. So this should be integrated into that. This should not be a one-time thing. And when you integrate it into your communication strategy to follow up, that's how you continue the work. That's how you do the work. That's how you stay committed as an anti-racist organization. And before you publish anything, outline the key message. If it's not clear, we talked about you need to be clear and transparent in your stance. So you need to go back, but outline the key message. What exactly are we trying to accomplish? Are we speaking directly to some of our audience members' challenges? Are we aware of the issue? Are we comfortable communicating the issue? Write the message as you normally would around the frameworks we just previously discussed. And then check it against the anti-racist framework. Are there opportunities to clean up the writing? Are you using oppressive or problematic language? Everything from lowercase, b, to, okay, how are we referring to this community? Is it Hispanic? Is it Latinx? Always audit your messaging. And then, is the piece solutions oriented? If you're doing any response to a timely moment, you need to have a solution. We don't want to do performative allyship, as we discussed earlier, where we're just focused on getting something out. We're beyond that moment. So next, we talked about messaging the moment. Now, this is messaging the movement. So this is the challenge I have for everybody here today. Artists and art organizations should know how to move beyond this familiar space and disrupt the complacencies and the strategies that we would usually apply, right? Whether we do it consciously or unconsciously. Artists, it's just in us. We don't default to old patterns. We're all about change. So it's really up to our industry to set a higher bar for shaping our ideas and be aware of what is possibility and of what is possible and how we can activate those audience and audiences that we're in service to. So you have to keep going. You can't do this once. You can't do this twice. It needs to be integrated into, who you are as an organization. people are waiting to see that follow through. So what does truly messaging the movement look like? It can look like centering lived experience in your programming and in your work. It can look like fostering personal and communal evolution, right? Working with the community, not just serving as a representative or this is what this community is, working within and with, protecting and strengthening culture, highlighting culture. So I have an actual example, I actually have a few examples of organizations that are already taking that best practices approach to driving equity and visibility within the arts. I know we have people from everywhere here. So Dallas Chamber Symphony, if you're in the house, you're doing a great job. But one way you can integrate that, especially in this new digital world, is to integrate it into your social media campaigns, right? Everybody's digital right now, and you're not going to have the same level of engagement and connection pretty much, and we're hoping we don't go through 2020 again. You're not going to have the same level of engagement as you've had this year on a digital scale. And in particular, you know, they are our Nielsen ratings. We know them for ratings, but they also do audience insights. Communities of color are exceptionally plugged in digitally, even before 2020. So if you're talking about reaching communities of color, a great way is to come up with a social media campaign that highlights their work, both from a historic perspective and community partnerships that you're doing. So the Dallas Chamber Symphony has Miss Notes, which is a weekly segment on highlighting underrepresented contemporaries. And they've been doing this for almost 2 months now. And it's a great way, one, to create content. If you're working as a social media manager, marketing manager, whatever title you have, you're always looking for really good content to engage. But two, it's a way of saying, hey, I'm plugged into this community and I want to highlight and celebrate their achievements and not focus on that compassion fatigue, right? Let's talk about the brilliance and resilience and the joy within this community and the talent. And they've done a great job of consistently, for weeks now, posting stories of people of color, but particularly those of the African diaspora who are composers. Another great example about being transparent about the, creating opportunities and expanding your leadership to include people of color is from the Spec Theater in Vancouver. They said, hey, it's been some time. This is at the end of July. We've been discussing next steps. Remember, one thing I said is that you don't have to have it all figured out. You can, in fact, say, we're going to figure out what the next steps are. We know immediately we're going to do this, or we'll follow up with you. Team Spec decided to follow up, and the actions they're taking are doing different offerings. We work in their governance board to decolonize their institution, and also a new podcast. And their podcast is actually going to focus on people of color in the arts. So those are different ways that you can openly communicate the institutional changes you're making, but then also find a way to build that anti-racist framework and messaging that you've been pushing out into your actual programming. Podcasting, of course, is forever trending over the last few years, and it's a really creative way to bring people of color in, and also an easy way to provide access to their audiences, right? So they can transcribe that and turn that into a blog post. They have many different opportunities to turn that into content that's easily digestible by various audiences. And so then you also have the Hunter Museum. And the Hunter Museum is about amplifying voices across channels, right? So this is an example of centering lived experience. There are people of color within your community. Wherever you are and wherever you're joining us today, there are various people of color. You have the channels that can support them as they build their own future. You know, art leaders have a responsibility to be connectors, collaborators, conveners, not representatives. So they can say, you know, what I love about this page is that it lives on their highest piece of real estate. And if you go to the actual page, they have their statement, but they also show you African American artists within their own collection, African American artists within the community, as well as Black-owned businesses that you can support. And this can be built out to incorporate other communities that often don't see themselves in these spaces, in museum spaces, in art spaces, and in no fault of their own. It's just that they aren't considered a primary audience member, or someone that wants to be engaged by an arts organization. So being able to go to a website and see your community and yourself there is a really great way to amplify voices, but then it's also a great way to be a connector as an art organization. And so I think this is a great example of how to use your channels to show your solidarity in a genuine and actionable way. And so I'm going to do a quick overview of what we went over today before we jump into questions. So you can pause, allow yourself to think strategically, reflect on your own organization, communicate, audit your communications channels and develop a style guide that fits your organization, and then address systemic issues in your industry, communicate the solutions that your organization is taking, and then effectively communicate your efforts to elevate people of color and all underserved communities, honestly. And I want to jump into the questions next.
Well, I also want to say thank you, Jessika. That was really amazing. I feel like the way that you broke down the step-by-step actions that you can take to really begin to tackle complex issues and figure out how to work out solutions is really, really important. So I'd like to encourage anyone that has any questions to please put it in the chat. And in the meantime, if you could maybe share a couple more case studies or examples of when, you know, what happens when someone, you know, waits the 24 to 48 hour period, or, you know, how they've responded where it's worked out well. And potentially as an organization, they historically may not have, they may not be located in a diverse area or directly have a diverse community that they serve, but still has made an impact in terms of their allyship.
Sure. So let's talk about the 24-hour to 48-hour gap. One thing is you're going to have a flood of responses initially from every brand. I'm talking about Coca-Cola to Nike to your local, you know, arts organization to your school district. So it doesn't hurt that you, it doesn't hurt you to take a pause, because you're really contributing to what we like to call the noise, right? And if you are able to be thoughtful and intentional, then your statement will have more impact if you get it out on day 3 than if you're one of thousands getting it out on day 1 or 2. And not only thousands get it out on day 1 or 2, you're getting it out and it's problematic. It hasn't been thought through. Your board hasn't seen it, so they can't say they support it. So they might feel caught off guard if they have a friend or a family member say, have you seen this? I'm a little uncomfortable with this. You know, so you want to make sure that you have a process, kind of a factory line for it, you know, loss of any other better term, to make sure everybody who needs to have a yes or approval has went through it. Another example, I'm trying to think of other examples of who did great work. I'm not gonna lie, that's hard to come by. When I was doing my research, it was very hard to show a great statement, because we were all, I don't want to say all, but most of us were caught off guard. And there really isn't a guide for this. You can't Google and say, well, how do I respond to this moment? Because we didn't know. I'm also seeing, and I want to jump into this part as far as a question, the tool, someone asked what the tool was that I was talking about earlier when you have implicit bias within your own organization. And the tool is called implicit, I want to make sure I have the exact.
I think we shared it in the chat.
Is it in there?
We did.
Okay, great.
Yeah, there
Project
is a question
implicit.
about, okay, yes, there is a question about someone as a contracted gig artist. I do not have an organizational platform from which to speak, but I still want to express solidarity and articulate the actions I want to take. Do you have any advice regarding this?
Sure. So as an individual artist, it's actually a little bit easier, right? So you don't have to go through the donors and the funders. And you need to be authentic and speak from the heart here. So one thing is, do you feel comfortable or educated enough to speak on these issues? If so, you can craft a statement using the exact same things that we went over in the checklist, being aware of the importance of language and the importance of identity when we're writing our statements and crafting our statements. That opportunity agenda structure that I was talking about, which is value, problem, solution, and action, all extremely important, and they can be applied to any messaging you take, not just in a racial and equity stance. So it can be how you approach any topic, and individuals can use that same framework to build out their messaging. Acknowledge where they are, even if they personally experience some of the barriers and the bias, they can share their story. Storytelling is powerful as an individual as well, and then come up with proposed solutions for the industry and the actions that they will take, and then hope that their audience online, whether it's on their social media channels, will plug in and encourage them to take action with you.
Okay, another question is, thank you so much. How do people / institutions rebound in the time of cancel culture?
So one thing I want to tell you, cancel culture doesn't exist. The reason I say that is that if you think about anybody who's being canceled on a large scale, it's more of a delay culture. They come back and weave themselves back into the framework. And the reason why I build in that pause, the 48 hours, is so you don't have to be part of that delay culture where you are canceled for X amount of time. But say you did it anyway, you pushed it out within a few hours because you had to get something out. The way you don't become part of cancel culture is to acknowledge that you messed up. It's nothing wrong. We're all taking this day by day in life and in other ways. So you acknowledge the mistakes you made, and then you also address the solutions you will make to remedy that. And you want to do that as soon as you start to see your brand perception turn sour.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the other question is, what tactics would you recommend for communicating the urgency of addressing the present moment to those trustees in particular who still feel it's safer to stay out of it?
Sure.
So how do you get them to understand that silence is not the answer and we need to say something and we need to move on it fairly quickly, even embracing this 24 to 48 hour window?
Sure. So that's an issue that I've definitely experienced as someone who worked in-house at a nonprofit. It's unfortunate because almost never you'll be able to get 100% participation. One thing, like I said, is that the challenge that I gave everybody here that I also want you to give to your board members and your trustees. Oh, can you hear me, Kelly?
It might be me. I just
I just want to check.
Was it Jessica?
Yeah, Jessica, you dipped out there for a second, so just
okay. Start again, please.
Sure. So the challenge I want to give to your board members and trustees is the same challenge that I said during the presentation, is ask them why they feel comfortable excluding groups. When we're talking about particularly identity, whether it's gender identity, racial identity, or, any different various identities, indigenous people, why do they feel comfortable? What things do they think are alienating donors? Why do they feel like the arts aren't possible to create change? And then from those responses, you can illustrate what possible next steps can be. I think people think that, advocacy exists, it's either black or white. No pun intended there, that it can exist on a spectrum. It can say, we address that, hey, our tickets are $300 or $400 for some of these presentations. Are we really talking to the diversity of the audience of our community in the ways that we always use such a diverse community, such a vibrant community? Are we actually, performing for a vibrant community, or does it look very white for lack of better words? Does it look very white? Does it look very elitist? And we can't leverage diversity and not actually practice that. And that's something you have to be able to communicate to your trustees and board members, and ideally be able to do that before we get to these moments. And also be aware, we all have it, problematic, board members, but they might have a great connection. Large donors who are awesome, but they say some things that are iffy. In both situations, we need to have kind of an emergency plan with how we address those particular donors. And that's what I've done as a communications director in-house is, okay, we're going to approach it this way with them. And so sometimes you have to come up with a strategy for those particular difficult members internally.
Okay. Our next question is, recognizing that groups of people with a shared identity are not monolithic, how do we ensure that our sounding board group / leadership team / board, etc., is reflective of the different points of view within these groups?
So one thing you want to do, and I think particularly because I always, when I say start a sounding board, most of them typically are in the same class. So they might look diverse from a visual standpoint. They're all very financially comfortable. Invite your front of line staff. I have opinions on differences in salary, but invite the person who's least paid. And I know this requires them doing work that shouldn't be other duties as assigned, but invite, if you're a museum, front of house, needs to be in these conversations. If you're a theater, maybe you're your janitor might need to be in these conversations. Unfortunately, it's skewed to where people at the front line tend to be people of color from a different class segment than your board members or even your executive directors, and they have different perspectives. So it's important to have an inclusive environment where everybody gets a say, not those who are in higher administration. And also, you need to continue that conversation. It can't be around building this messaging out, and then you go, okay, thanks, go back to your job and other duties as assigned. This isn't a retreat that you do once a year. This is making sure that your staff are included in all of your high-level decision-making throughout the year, particularly when it comes to communications, because they also provide word of mouth. I've worked for so many organizations, and you wouldn't believe when you see a statement, I get a call from a cousin or a friend, and they go, that's you? Because I know it's not really like that. So they can provide word of mouth too. So you want to make them feel included and that their voices are also heard. So always look for front of house, look for schools. If you do youth education, it's a great opportunity to bring some of those teachers in. If you do family free nights as an organization or reduced price nights, it's a great time to have a survey and ask them, ask your patrons if they're interested in either completing the equity survey or being part of a community advisory board for these issues. Those are great opportunities to do outreach to your community and also get their voice included in your communication strategy.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions? I can't see everybody all at once either. Jessika, is there anything else that you want to share with us that you think it's important for us to keep in mind when we're thinking about how we're messaging this moment and or messaging the movement?
I think the most important thing is consistency. And we see that in any form of communications, is that we might start something, especially because, like I say, of our capacity as an organization. That's a great idea. That's a great campaign. What I'm going to be looking for are organizations, if we completely return back to what we consider some sense of normalcy, I'm going to be looking for organizations beyond their year-end campaign in 2021. How are they communicating and how are they communicating all of these beliefs that they pushed out in June, right? Through their programming, through their communication channels. This time next year, I want to be able to hold you accountable and see that you've consistently fostered community partnerships, that you've included people of color in your imagery, and not just as background figures and passive figures, that you've invited their voices to the table. And it's not just me, it's your audience. If they love you, if they write a donation check, or if they share your content, they're looking for you to be consistent in your voice and in your stance. And so that's what everybody's looking for. Do not start anything that you cannot make a promise, deliver on a promise, or that you can't keep consistent. So if you do one very great campaign and you continue it and it's part of something you do every year, that's more impactful than a rush of different, commitments that by December we won't be able to follow up on, and that you've exhausted your staff trying to implement to be quote unquote woke. So be consistent and be aware of your capabilities and capacity. And in times where you have need, you might need to bring on extra people to stay consistent.
Okay, there is one final question, which is a little bit off-brand, which is a really bad joke. And the question is around ally fatigue. Do you have any thoughts about how organizations or individuals can deal with this notion of ally fatigue? And maybe you want to offer just a little bit of a context or a definition for those who may not be aware?
Sure. So I always say that a great example of ally fatigue is, I had a lot of friends who told me that I needed to read Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, which was hilarious to me because I love Ibram's work, but also I don't feel like I'm necessarily the audience there, but it's always things to learn. But let's use Black bookstores. So we said, all allies will purchase from Black bookstores. They ran out and had back orders for weeks and weeks and weeks. And now we're starting to see articles about these bookstores where people ordered these books, they came in and they never picked them up because they're done. That happened in June. The book got here in August. We're tired. We're tired of hearing about it. We want to go back to our normal lives. And in particular, we love that the arts can provide us an escape, right? And so we don't want to do these actions anymore. And I think a way to avoid saying, this is the work, this is the work, this is the work, this is what you need to do, is to do something like what the Dallas Symphony Orchestra did, which is integrate it into your day-to-day. Make it a social media campaign. Make it something that they will share. Because sharing an interesting history fact about a person of color in the arts is an action. It is education. And yes, it's on a base level. It might not be signing a petition or hitting the streets, but it's still moving that needle towards change. And that's how we can be catalysts for change without exhausting our audiences who are new to what being an ally is and might feel burnt out from being told to take actions or make donations.
Thank you so much. Well, Jessika, again, thank you so much for a great presentation. The slides will be available for those who've attended. And we want to really, really thank you again for sharing some really grateful tips. And I hope that you would consider doing a part 2 as we move through the year and we experience the transition. We'll have to continue to message and to continue to move. So thank you everyone for joining us. If you want to know more about Mid-America Arts Alliance, please visit MAAA.org. And if you're interested in signing up with the newsletter, I know that Karis put it in the chat, and be sure to keep up to date with us, and we'll let you know what else we have going on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.